Hi, this is Steve from Nothing Ventured, Nothing Gained, here to bring you a new GM tip video, this time on how to deal with monsters that can cast spells. Stay tuned. So whether you're a first-time GM dipping your toes into spellcasting, or even a veteran who has a good handle on the game, you're going to run into a situation where your monster has so many spells that you don't recognize, or you just don't know what the best option is, that you're going to feel that there is no possible good choice, and then everything's going to come crashing down. Not really, but so when you add spellcasting to monsters, things can slow down to a crawl very quickly. So I've come up with a system that I think I'm going to use in the future, and I figured I'd share it with all of you. And it's how to speed up spellcasting. Now, we've all seen a monster stat block, and the stat block generally has all the information you're going to need to run that monster in combat. How fast it moves, how much health does it have left, its attacks, how much damage does it deal, any special things that it's immune to or resistant or weak to, and also all of its special attacks and kind of weird quirky stuff. Now, a situation came up in our last game where the monster had ability to cast spells, but it wasn't a predominantly a spellcaster, so it was a little bit of melee and physical attacks, and had a little bit of spellcasting. But the game really kind of pushed this monster into more of the spellcasting role because there was weird stuff happening in the game. When you're looking at your monster stat block, and then your monster stat block says, hey, you should look this spell up. So I played enough to know, without having to look it up, a lot of these different spells. But especially from edition to edition to edition, especially if you're swapping from one edition to a game, or a completely one game to another game, if you're going from Dungeons & Dragons, going to Pathfinder, switching from Pathfinder to Dungeons & Dragons, going to GURPS, any one of these games that have magic in their game, everything's going to work a little bit differently. But you may not have the back-end knowledge of all of these spells because maybe you've never dabbled in spellcasting. Maybe you only played that Barbarian. You know how to cast Axe over and over again. But at the end of the day, you need to know how these spells work. The problem is, there's so many of them. And especially when you come into a monster stat block and they give you a slew of spells that some of them may not even be relevant to combat. Maybe it's kind of just to give you an idea of what kind of things that this monster will do when it's not fighting. Which is a good piece of information to have, but it is not useful when you're running that monster in combat and your initiative comes up for that monster and that monster needs to now do something. So I kind of been dabbling with this idea of not scrapping the spell idea, but especially for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the way monsters work is different than the way players work. So the rules for players are not necessarily the rules for monsters. So given this dichotomy that they built into the game, why don't we take that one step further with spells and magic? And when your stat block is asking you to do all this work, the stat block is no longer helping you, it's now a hindrance. So, onto the concept that I've had in dealing with how to make the stat block work for me. Now, the website called PF2 Tools, to make a stat block, there was a monster that we fought in the last game, like I mentioned before. I have the Nethys version of this monster I'm going to put somewhere here, and I'm going to have my own version as well over here. And we're going to go flip back and forth between the two, and you're going to see the minor changes that I made. And I made very small changes. But the one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to generally boil down spellcasting into one two action activity that has a variety of choices that the GM can make. Because in general, fights aren't hundreds of feet long. I will say that right now. In this fight, Jared knew that in this fight, I think the biggest distance was like 60 feet. So if I know that the biggest distance is 60 feet, and this is something that the monster was expecting to happen, and I'm going to make the monster have 3 different types of magic that they can do. One with at maximum range, but that's going to split the damage with 2 people, so it's mitigating the damage by multiple targets. A second attack that's shorter range, but still a ranged attack. And it does a little bit more damage, but only affects 1 target. And I have a third attack that happens if it can touch somebody. It's going to do a little bit more damage because it is now next to somebody. Now it has a choice whether it can use this 2-action attack spell, or it can just attack it, just bite people. Arr. So it has now a choice of doing one of the two things. Maybe it does both. Maybe it realizes that the fighter standing next to it has attack of opportunity, so it's not going to bother casting magic because it's going to get a free hit. It's going to get attacked for free. So these are the things. Now our monster has choices, and those choices matter, but I don't have to look up these rules in another spot. They're right here, right on my little stat block here, and I don't have to worry about it. And they're generally balanced for what the monster can already do. So the stat block before I changed it already says that the monster can do occult spells. So all I did was I look at the occult cantrips, and it said it could cast 3 spells. So let's look at the initial stat block for the monster, and let's see the problem that was run into when this monster was run in our game. Now, I'm going to butcher this name because this is the weird alien worm type creature. A Selgothy Servant. Now, if I butcher that name, yell at me in the comments. But it has a bite attack, and it does poison. And it has a weapon attack because in his tail is kind of like a longsword and it can stab people. It can poison, it kind of can drool over its sword and poison the sword if it wants to, but that's an action. And it has this kind of like exuding aura around it that possibly cause confusion. And it has a cool reaction when someone is confused by this kind of aura. It has a reaction that it can do to kind of mess with them. Great. Now we're going to look at the spells. Okay, we have the occult list. Perfect. Now I know what spell list that I can pull from that would kind of be normal, because this is an aberration, so it is kind of like a weird alien creature. It gives me its DC and its attack. Great. This is the information that I need to know. Perfect. We haven't run into a problem yet. Now here's the problem. It can cast hypercognition, levitate, and mind reading. That's the spell slots that it has. Okay, great. What do they do? I have to now go click. If I was in Nethys here, I have to go click on each one or pull up my book and look at it. And the problem is none of those spells are really combat spells. So they're here, and they do give me an idea of what this monster's probably doing when it's not in combat. But in combat, none of these spells are useful. But I don't know that until I look these spells up. One of these lets me make a whole bunch of knowledge checks. Okay, great. So we know that this monster likes knowledge. Levitate, I get to float around, and I know that because I've been playing D&D for a while, but you may not know that. It lets you float an object, but it can only target an unaccompanied object or a willing creature. So if it's in combat, it's not levitating, maybe levitating one of its friends, its allies, but in this case, it was a single combat. It was just this one worm, and the room was doing stuff to us. And mind reading. This gives you an informed look onto what the monster is doing when it isn't fighting. It's trying to absorb knowledge. It's trying to make all these knowledge checks. It can fly and float around. Great. But from a perspective of a combat encounter, these spells aren't useful. But the problem is Jared had to look them up. And Jared gave them Jared had run a modified version of this monster, and he gave them a kind of extra abilities that were kind of relevant to the encounter that we were fighting in. But then you look at the cantrips. Okay. It's got Daze, which is a pretty weak attack cantrip. It's got Detect Magic, Mage Hand. Yet again, 2 spells that are not really relevant in combat unless like you're trying to keep the MacGuffin away from the party. Mage Hand is useful then. Detect Magic, you're not really going to be casting that in combat. And Telekinetic Projectile. Now, I know Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that's the one combat spell that this monster has. But given the numbers of what the monster can already do when it's next to something, and also what it can do at a decent range, I kind of figured, and I looked at also occult spells and see kind of what I was dealing with. So in this case, the telekinetic projectile is going to do 3d6 plus 4 damage to one target, and it can crit. So it can do double damage. Doesn't seem too bad, because if you look at its main attack, its bite, it's got a plus 17 to hit, and its magic is only plus 16. And it does 2d6 plus 5 damage, plus the person getting bit has a chance to be poisoned by the poison of the creature, which does an additional d6, and it can also give it some conditions. And it could get worse if you keep failing your save. So considering that, I kind of boiled their spells down into one action. It's a single 2-action activity. So remember, we're going from basically the only attack cantrip or the only attack spell that this monster has is Telekinetic Projectile, which is a 30-foot range spell, and it does 1d6 plus your spellcasting modifier. In this case, I believe it's Wisdom, It's either wisdom or charisma because it does have a +5 charisma, so you can make a +5. I went with +4 because this creature dealt with a lot of mental effects, immune to mental effects. So I figured wisdom would be a nice place to go, but wisdom versus charisma, it's a 1-point difference. So I looked at the occult spells, and I wanted to get a variety of damage. And I wanted to get 3 different ranges. I wanted to get the maximum range that I could get, but the least amount of damage, a moderate amount of damage in the mid-range, and I wanted a touch spell. Because I looked at, they had Chilling Touch as one of the occult cantrips, and I'm like, that's a cool spell. Plus, it gives me a variety of damage types to mess with the party. So remember, I just picked a name for this ability called Coalesce Energy. Because in the fight, different elements were kind of like a thing in the room, so this kind of made sense where it was able to like steal energy from the kind of the room, the ambient energy in the room, because it's kind of like how the lore went with this monster. So okay, so I picked 3 different ranges. I picked 60 feet, and they're all separated by damage types. So basically, this spell says choose one of the damage types below, and this spell gains that trait. Make a spell attack against the target's AC. So these are all spell attacks. So none of these are just make a save. You could add in save-based spells and kind of change it up. If you want to make something that maybe affect 2 different targets akin to like electric arc, you can say, okay, we'll make reflex saves or make 42 saves or what have you. But I just went simple. We're making attack rolls. We're not worried about the saves because it already has a thing where if you're around it, you have to make saves. So I don't want to double up on the saves. Trying to make this simple. So we have a 60-foot range effect. The first thing I think of in 60-foot range, and I know that it's an arcane spell, but it's magic missile. But in this case, the occult spellist had a cool spell that kind of mimicked magic missile, but it was with an attack roll. So within 60-foot range, you can use force damage, and you shoot 2 force bolts, but you have to choose 2 different targets. And each force bolt does 2d4 plus 2 damage. So I'm forced to split my damage between 2 different targets. So I'm not hitting one person so significantly that I'm going to drop them before they get into range. Remember, we're not trying to kill the party. We're trying to be threatening to the party. And this is something that it's, okay, so I have to pick 2 different targets, or am I picking one target? It's only going to do 2d4 plus 2. So in essence, it's like a third. Imagine I just took what a 3rd level magic missile would do. Since it's an attack roll, I'm saying that this can crit. So you can do 44 plus 4 damage to one target if they crit. Now remember, you're rolling these dice independently. So player 1, you're hitting a fighter, roll a d20. Okay, well I hit you, and then now the wizard, I'll roll d20. Well, I rolled a 20, so I crit you, and then now you take double damage. Now that's the long range, right? It doesn't do that much damage, and it does split the damage between 2 people. So now you're not worried about instantly dropping somebody. Now, akin to telekinetic projectile, which is a spell we know what was already on its list, we're going to say that we have a 30-foot range spell that only targets one person, but if we hit, it does 3d6 plus 4 damage. And yet again, we're going to say that this can crit. This is like, the mid-range is kind of like the most dangerous area for this thing, because, well, number one, it doesn't want you next to it, right? It has stuff that messes with you while you're next to it, but that's the last thing it wants is someone next to it. But it has things to deal with it if you are next to it. So we can get there in a second. But this is just basically a 3rd level telekinetic projectile. One target takes either piercing or bludgeoning damage, and we're going to say it does 3d6 plus 4 damage. And if I happen to crit you, it's going to do 66 plus 8 damage. And then we have if you're really close to it and it's really not liking you that you're this close to it. And we have negative energy. And it already has, when we take a look at the Occult Spell list, it already has Chilling Touch on its spell list. So this isn't too far-fetched an idea of Chilling Touch. And we're not actually taking Chilling Touch directly, but we're using it as a template. So if you're in touch range, we're going to be able to do 4d4 plus 4 touch damage. So in essence, we're taking all the damage that we would have done at range and doing it to one person next to us. So now this is a quite dangerous place to be in. Now on a critical hit, we're not saying this damage doubles because I think that 8d4 plus 8 damage is a lot to expect a 6th or 7th level party to deal with. That's a lot of damage. But what I am going to do is I'm going to affix at a condition to a critical hit. So on a regular hit or critical hit, this is still going to do 4d4 plus 4 damage. But on a critical hit, and you would make a person make a save on this, you make them drained 1. Right, so drained 1, lowers your hit points by your level. So if you're a 6th level person, you just lost 6 hit points out the gate. And your hit points, your max total of hit points went down. You take a -1 for your constitution check. Anytime you're rolling a check that's based on your constitution, you take a -1 to it, which includes fortitude saves. So this is how I changed spellcasting. So now I have this list of all the stuff this monster can do right here. I don't have to look up another book. It's all right here, and it's all pretty simple. I'm not doing fancy. But what I'm also doing is in the tags, I put a little note for myself. This is a spell. It says somatic and verbal components because it's a 2-action spell, and almost all spells have somatic and verbal components if they have 2 actions. And it's a spell. So when someone asks, oh, what is that? What are they doing? They're casting magic. Okay, well, I have a reaction for that. I have a reaction that gives me a +2 on my save versus that magic, or +2 to AC versus magic. Okay, great. Or I want to counterspell that. Okay, great. Make your roll. You recognize the spell. It's just coalescing natural energies that are in the room. I'll let you counterspell that, and it's at XY level. Make your counteract check, and you have to burn up a spell. Yes, at this point, we are bending the rules outside of the game to make it easier for us to run monsters. Because I don't care how many spells this monster has. I care what can I use in combat. Now, outside of combat, it's using all of its spells that it's listed. Like I still appreciate the fact that there has a list of spells that this monster can do. And that gives us an idea of what they should be doing when the monster isn't fighting the players. Maybe it's gathering information. Maybe it's working for a higher power and it's used to just gather information and maybe keep an eye on the party and kind of give notes to the big bad of what the party's doing, so the big bad is prepared for what the party can bring. That makes sense. That makes sense to what the spells of this monster can bring with its actual spell slot spells. But when it comes to combat, we need to know what this monster can do, how it can do it, and a quick reference to be able to do it without having to look at the 9 different books and trying to figure out, oh, can I do this? Can I do that? And like I said, this one is easy because even at melee range, it has to choose. Do I spend 2 actions to cast this spell that someone's right next to me and I want to drain them? Or does it just try to poison them and bite them or stab them with their longsword? Because like I said, this is a big worm with a little sword that keeps stabbing them. Does it spend time and spend actions like poisoning its weapon for the next attack? Because from a damage standpoint, it's better off biting because it's got a much higher to hit and it does more damage and it automatically poisons. This is just my thought process when I'm looking at a stat block. I just want everything in one spot. I don't want to have to look at other books and other resources to figure out what I can do during my turn because I know the players are waiting for what happens next. And you want to hold that tension. And what the one worst thing that can break immersion is, hold on, I got to figure out what my monster can do. So I know when I run games, I'm going to try to really use this system and kind of modify monsters to really work for me, not against me. But let me know what you've done in your games to try to make spellcasting for monsters a bit easier pill to swallow. Maybe you like the system. Maybe you don't like the system. Just let us know in the comments down below. But until then, this is Steve from Nothing Ventured, Nothing Gamed. May your die rolls be crits, and may you always roll max damage. See you later.